The Miller family steps into the quiet luxury of the airport lounge, unaware that their mere presence will trigger a confrontation unlike any they've faced before. Across the room, a woman's gaze lingers on them, growing colder with every passing second. When she finally makes her move, her words are sharp, her accusations bitter. But what happens next is something none of them could have anticipated. Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's dive in. The bustling airport was a familiar setting for the Miller family. Jonathan, a successful attorney, had spent years traveling for work, and his wife Maya, a well-respected doctor, was no stranger to the fast-paced life of medical conferences and lectures. Their daughter, Layla, though only 17, had grown accustomed to jet-setting with her parents, tagging along on trips to new cities and exotic destinations. Yet, despite their extensive travel history, there was always a lingering feeling of unease that came with being in certain spaces. Luxurious spaces where their presence was often met with subtle glances and quiet judgments. Today was no different. As the Miller family walked into the exclusive airport lounge, they were greeted by the soft glow of recessed lighting, plush leather chairs, and a soothing soundtrack of ambient music. The lounge was quiet, filled with passengers waiting for their first-class flights to whisk them off to various corners of the world. A few heads turned briefly as the Millers made their way toward a seating area, but most people quickly resumed their conversations or returned to scrolling through their phones. Layla, ever the observant one, noticed the fleeting glances, but chose to ignore them. She had grown used to the quiet scrutiny that often followed her family. Despite being raised in privilege, she was keenly aware of how her family's skin color sometimes made them stand out in these environments. Still, she didn't let it bother her much anymore, at least not on the surface. "Nice place," Layla said under her breath, her eyes scanning the room as she slung her backpack onto the floor and plopped into a chair. Maya smiled softly at her daughter. "It is a good place to relax before our flight." She glanced at Jonathan, who had already settled into his seat, scrolling through emails on his tablet. He was the picture of calm, as always. The family had a long day ahead of them. Jonathan had been working on a high-profile case, one that had dominated much of his time recently, and this trip was meant to be a brief respite from the chaos of their everyday lives. For Maya, the break was equally welcomed. She had been juggling shifts at the hospital and balancing her private practice, so the thought of a few days away was a breath of fresh air. As they sat together, the Miller family looked every bit the part of a successful, well-traveled unit. Jonathan's tailored suit and polished shoes gave him an air of authority. Maya, with her flawless makeup and sleek business attire, exuded elegance and professionalism. And Layla, despite her more casual look of jeans and a hoodie, had the natural confidence of someone who had grown up in privilege. But not everyone in the lounge was as accepting of the Millers' presence. Sitting across the room, Linda couldn't stop staring. She had been in the lounge for about half an hour, sipping her coffee and browsing a magazine, but the moment the Miller family entered, her attention shifted. There was something about them that irked her, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it at first. It wasn't just their appearance, though that certainly played a role. It was the way they carried themselves, the ease with which they entered a space she considered exclusive. Linda, a middle-aged woman dressed in designer clothes, came from a background that valued tradition and exclusivity. She was raised to believe that certain spaces were reserved for people like her, people who belonged. And while she didn't know anything about the Millers, the sight of them made her feel uncomfortable. She muttered, narrowing her eyes as she watched Jonathan casually flip through documents on his tablet. Her discomfort grew as she noticed Maya laughing softly at something Layla had said. They seemed too at ease, too comfortable in this space. Linda's discomfort quickly morphed into something darker. She began to fixate on them, unable to shake the feeling that they didn't belong. As the minutes ticked by, her irritation bubbled just beneath the surface. It wasn't just that they were here. It was that they seemed to feel entitled to be here, as though this space was theirs to enjoy without question. To Linda, this was a breach of some unspoken rule. She crossed her arms, her fingers tapping impatiently against her sleeve. She caught the eye of a man sitting next to her, but he quickly looked away, sensing the brewing tension. Linda had always been vocal about her opinions, especially when it came to issues of class and propriety. She believed in order, in people knowing their place, and in the unspoken rules of society. And right now, she felt those rules were being broken. As she continued to stew, the Miller family remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing across the lounge. Layla had pulled out her phone, her fingers dancing across the screen as she texted her friends about the trip. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his focus on the work emails that never seemed to stop, even when he was technically on vacation. And Maya, ever the attentive mother, glanced occasionally at her daughter, content to see her happy. Linda, however, couldn't let it go. She tried to return to her magazine, but the words on the page blurred as her mind raced with frustration. Why were they here? How could they afford this? It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. Finally, after several more minutes of internal turmoil, Linda stood up, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor as she marched toward the Miller family. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp enough to slice through the quiet hum of the lounge. Jonathan looked up from his tablet, surprised by the sudden intrusion. Maya glanced at Linda, her smile fading as she sensed the tension radiating from the woman. "Yes, can we help you?" Jonathan asked, his tone polite but cautious. He could already tell this wasn't a friendly encounter. Linda crossed her arms, her expression hardening. "I just wanted to make sure you're aware that this is a first-class lounge," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "You know, reserved for certain types of passengers." The emphasis on certain types wasn't lost on Jonathan or Maya. Layla, who had been staring at her phone, looked up, her eyes wide with disbelief. She had seen microaggressions before, but this was blatant. Jonathan remained calm, his lawyer training kicking in. He had faced worse in the courtroom. "Yes, we're aware," he said coolly. "We're flying first class." Linda blinked, momentarily thrown off by his response. She hadn't expected them to answer so matter-of-factly, as though they truly belonged here. "Well," she said, recovering quickly, "I just think it's important for everyone to understand the kind of space this is. Some people don't seem to realize that not everyone is meant to be in places like this." Maya, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke up, her voice steady. "And what exactly do you mean by that?" Linda's eyes narrowed, her lips thinning into a tight line. She wasn't about to back down now. "I mean," she said, her voice growing louder, "that there are standards, and some people just don't meet those standards." Jonathan's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. "We've met every standard required to be here," he said firmly. "I suggest you go back to your seat." The tension in the lounge was palpable. Other passengers had started to take notice, their conversations quieting as they watched the scene unfold. Linda, realizing she was attracting attention, took a step back, but her indignation remained. "This isn't over," she muttered under her breath before turning and storming back to her seat. The Miller family was left in stunned silence. Layla, who had been holding her breath, exhaled slowly. Maya placed a comforting hand on her daughter's shoulder, while Jonathan remained quiet, his thoughts simmering beneath the surface. The incident had shaken them, but they refused to let it ruin their day. Still, the damage had been done. As they sat in silence, the weight of the confrontation lingered in the air. Little did they know, this was only the beginning of a series of events that would challenge not just their patience, but their very belief in the world around them. Linda returned to her seat with a sense of satisfaction, but the knot of anger in her chest hadn't loosened. In fact, it seemed to tighten with each passing second. She had never been one to let things slide, and the Miller family's presence in the lounge had struck a nerve she couldn't ignore. Even after her initial outburst, something kept gnawing at her, as if the situation wasn't entirely settled. She glanced around the lounge, half expecting someone to validate her actions, but all she saw were uncomfortable stares. People were whispering behind their hands, avoiding her gaze. She huffed and turned her attention to the window, the expansive runway stretching out beneath the morning sky. A plane took off in the distance, its rumble fading into the horizon. She tried to focus on the magazine in front of her, flipping through the glossy pages, but her mind kept drifting back to the Millers. Why did it bother her so much? What was it about them that made her so uneasy? Linda had always been someone who prided herself on hard work, discipline, and knowing her place in the world. Raised in a family that had struggled to maintain its middle-class status, she had grown up watching her parents scrape and sacrifice for every inch of success they had achieved. Her father, a factory worker, had drilled into her the importance of hard work, telling her that nothing would be handed to her in life. She believed in that lesson so deeply that, over time, she had started to view anyone who didn't follow the same path with suspicion, especially those who seemed to have surpassed her in wealth or status. It didn't help that, over the years, Linda had watched her own career plateau. She had worked as an office manager for a small firm for nearly 2 decades. While she had been competent and reliable, promotions had eluded her. As younger colleagues, many of whom in her view hadn't paid their dues, started rising through the ranks, she felt left behind, her ambitions stifled. It didn't seem fair. And it was during this period of frustration that she began to harbor deeper resentments. In her mind, certain things were supposed to happen in a specific order. You work hard, you stay in your lane, and eventually, you're rewarded. But life had repeatedly shown her that the world didn't work that way. People who hadn't struggled as much as she had were getting ahead, and it rankled her. Her thoughts turned back to the Millers. There they were, in the first-class lounge, dressed in their expensive clothes, acting as though they belonged. Linda couldn't help but wonder how they had gotten there. It wasn't as though they had come from money, surely. They didn't fit the mold of the people she was used to seeing in these kinds of spaces. Maybe they had used some shortcut, some handout, or perhaps they were just lucky. Either way, in Linda's mind, they hadn't earned it in the way she had earned her place in life. She clenched her jaw, feeling the familiar resentment bubble to the surface. Meanwhile, across the lounge, Jonathan and Maya sat in an uncomfortable silence. Layla had her earbuds in, pretending to listen to music, but Jonathan knew that his daughter wasn't lost in her playlist. She was processing what had just happened, just like they were. He glanced over at Maya, who was flipping through her phone absently. She was calm, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. Years of practice had taught them both how to keep their composure in situations like this, but that didn't mean it hurt any less. "Are you okay?" Jonathan asked quietly, leaning toward his wife. Maya nodded slowly, but she didn't meet his eyes. "I'm fine," she said, her voice steady. "It's just exhausting, you know? I thought we were past this." Jonathan sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "I know, I just hate that Layla had to see it." Maya nodded again, and for a moment, the weight of the moment hung between them, unspoken but deeply felt. It wasn't the first time they had faced this kind of overt racism, but it still stung every time. Jonathan had spent his entire career fighting against biases in the courtroom, challenging systems that marginalized people who looked like him. But in moments like this, where the attack was so personal and direct, it felt different. It felt raw. Layla, despite her outward coolness, was struggling too. She had been raised to be proud of who she was, to carry herself with confidence. But there were still moments, like now, when the ugliness of the world hit her in ways that left her feeling vulnerable. She stared at her phone, pretending to scroll through social media, but her thoughts were a tangled mess of anger, confusion, and hurt. Why did people like Linda still exist? Why couldn't they just live their lives without being judged for something as arbitrary as the color of their skin? She glanced over at her parents. They were quiet now, both lost in their own thoughts. Layla knew they were trying to stay strong for her, and she appreciated that. But she also wished they didn't have to. Why couldn't they just be a normal family, sitting in an airport lounge, waiting for their flight like everyone else? Why did moments like this have to happen? Jonathan, sensing the tension building in his daughter, reached out and placed a hand on her knee. "Hey, you okay?" Layla pulled out one earbud, giving him a half-hearted smile. "Yeah, I'm fine." But Jonathan could see the hurt in her eyes, the same hurt he had felt so many times before. He wished he could shield her from it, but he knew that was impossible. The world was what it was, and all they could do was navigate it as best they could. I'm proud of you, he said softly, for keeping your head up. Layla nodded, her eyes flicking over to where Linda was sitting. The woman was still there, her back turned to them now, but the weight of her words lingered in the air. Layla felt her chest tighten. I just don't get why people are like that, she murmured. It's not fair. Jonathan didn't have an answer for her. It wasn't fair. It never had been, and it likely never would be, but they had to keep moving forward anyway. Maya, sensing the emotional weight of the moment, reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand. We're stronger than that, she said quietly. We don't let people like her define us. Layla nodded, but the bitterness remained. She knew her parents were right, but it was still hard to swallow. She hated that they had to deal with this at all. On the other side of the lounge, Linda continued to sit in silence, her thoughts swirling in a storm of resentment. She didn't know the Miller family's history, their struggles, or their triumphs. She didn't know about Jonathan's fight for justice in the courtroom, or Maya's years of medical training, where she had to work twice as hard to prove herself in a system that doubted her abilities because of her race. And she certainly didn't know about Layla's quiet strength, built up over years of experiencing the same quiet slights and overt aggressions. All Linda knew was her own story, her own frustrations and disappointments, and in her mind, the Millers were an affront to that story. They represented a world that was changing in ways she didn't understand, and she resented them for it. But as the lounge grew quieter and the minutes ticked by, Linda found herself increasingly isolated. No one had come to her defense. In fact, most people were avoiding her altogether. The satisfaction she had initially felt after confronting the Millers was rapidly fading, replaced by an uncomfortable sense that maybe, just maybe, she had been in the wrong. But admitting that, even to herself, was a step too far for Linda. For now, she would sit in her own frustration, unwilling to reflect on why she felt the way she did. And on the other side of the lounge, the Miller family would sit in quiet solidarity, bound together by an unspoken understanding of the world they lived in, one that demanded strength, resilience, and grace in the face of adversity. The minutes ticked by in the airport lounge, but the silence between the Millers and Linda felt heavier than the noise of the jets taking off outside. Linda, still sitting stiffly in her chair across the room, simmered. The incident earlier had left her agitated, but the lack of any support from the people around her only made it worse. They had seen the same thing she had, right? Surely they understood that something about the Miller family's presence felt wrong. Linda cast a glance around the room, searching for some sign of validation, anyone who might share her discomfort, even in a subtle way. But the other passengers in the lounge were avoiding her gaze entirely. Most of them had returned to their distractions, phones, laptops, tablets. Still, the air held a palpable tension, a tension that made it clear they were all aware of the earlier confrontation, even if they weren't acknowledging it aloud. Meanwhile, the Miller family remained in their seats, visibly shaken but silent. Layla had taken to fidgeting with her phone, scrolling through social media feeds without really paying attention. Her mind was still replaying the scene from a few minutes ago. The words Linda had thrown at them were not new to her, but hearing them so openly, so unapologetically, in a place that was supposed to be about comfort and luxury, that was new, and it hurt. Jonathan, sensing his daughter's distress, leaned in toward her. Layla, don't let that get to you, okay? You're stronger than her words. Layla didn't respond immediately. She appreciated her father's attempt to comfort her, but in that moment, she wasn't sure strength was enough. Her mind was still racing. What if the other people in the lounge agreed with Linda? What if they were thinking the same things but were just too polite or too cowardly to say them out loud? Maya noticed her daughter's silence and shifted in her seat to face her. Sweetheart, she said softly, sometimes people's words come from a place of ignorance and fear. It's not about you. It's about them. Layla's eyes welled up for a brief moment, but she quickly blinked away the tears. I just don't get it, Mom, she murmured, her voice barely audible. What did we do wrong? We're just sitting here, like everyone else. Maya reached out, gently tucking a strand of hair behind Layla's ear. You didn't do anything wrong, she said firmly. Remember that. As they spoke, Jonathan kept a close eye on Linda. He could tell she wasn't done, not yet. There was a restless energy in the way she kept shifting in her seat, her eyes darting around the room. It was as if she was waiting for something, perhaps hoping for someone to back her up. When no one did, Jonathan could see the frustration building behind her steely gaze. And then, just as he feared, she stood up again. Jonathan's stomach tightened as he watched her approach, this time with even more determination in her steps. He took a deep breath, preparing himself for whatever was about to happen next. He knew that responding with anger or raising his voice would only make things worse. But it was difficult to stay calm in moments like these. Every fiber of his being wanted to protect his family, to shield them from this unprovoked hostility. Linda stopped a few feet from the miller's table, her arms crossed and her face set in a look of cold indignation. She didn't care that the room had gone quiet again, or that all eyes were now on her. "I don't think you understand," she said sharply, her voice louder than before. "People like you don't just waltz into places like this and expect to be treated the same as everyone else." Jonathan clenched his jaw, but before he could respond, Maya spoke up. "And what exactly do you mean by people like us?" Maya's voice was steady, controlled, but there was an edge to it that Jonathan hadn't heard in a long time. Linda's eyes narrowed, and for a split second, she hesitated. But her resentment overpowered her caution. "You know what I mean. People who think they can just climb the ladder through shortcuts, through whatever connections or handouts you've gotten. People who haven't earned their place." Maya inhaled sharply, her eyes locking with Linda's. The lounge had fallen completely silent now. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. The other passengers were no longer pretending to be distracted. They were watching, waiting. "You don't know anything about us," Maya said quietly, but her words were laced with controlled fury. "You don't know what we've earned or how hard we've worked to get here. And frankly, it's not your place to decide who belongs here and who doesn't." Linda's face flushed with anger, but before she could respond, a voice interrupted her. "That's enough." The words came from across the room, and they were calm but authoritative. All eyes turned toward an older man seated near the window. He was dressed in a sharp suit, his gray hair slicked back with precision. He had been quietly observing the situation from the start, and now it seemed he had decided to step in. "I think it's time for you to sit down," the man said to Linda, his tone leaving little room for argument. Linda, clearly startled by the intervention, turned to face the man. "Excuse me," she snapped, her voice defensive. "This is none of your business." The man raised an eyebrow, unfazed by her hostility. "Oh, but it is. You see, we're all paying customers here. We all have the right to be treated with respect, no matter what someone like you might think." Jonathan exchanged a glance with Maya, a silent acknowledgement that, finally, someone had decided to speak up. They had grown used to handling these kinds of situations on their own, rarely expecting anyone to step in and defend them. But now, for the first time in what felt like forever, they weren't alone in this fight. A few murmurs of agreement rippled through the lounge, and several other passengers nodded in support of the older man's statement. Linda's eyes flicked nervously around the room, her confidence wavering as she realized she no longer had the silent approval she had hoped for. "You should apologize," the man continued, his voice still calm but firm, "to this family and to everyone here for disrupting what was supposed to be a peaceful space." Linda's face turned bright red. She glanced around the room again, this time noticing the looks of disapproval from the other passengers. Her bravado was crumbling. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. Jonathan sat back slightly in his seat, relieved but cautious. He knew people like Linda didn't just back down easily. Even now, he could see the war going on inside her, whether to double down on her hostility or retreat. He hoped she would choose the latter. And then, in a huff of frustration, Linda turned on her heel and stormed back to her seat. She grabbed her purse with a jerky motion, muttering something under her breath, and then, without another word, she left the lounge, her footsteps echoing down the hall as she disappeared from view. The silence in the room lingered for a moment longer, and then the air seemed to relax. Conversations slowly resumed, though the awkward tension still hovered at the edges. The older man caught Jonathan's eye and gave him a small nod, a gesture of solidarity before returning to his book. Jonathan let out a long breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Maya reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. Layla, still shaken, took out her earbuds and stared at the empty space where Linda had been standing just moments ago. "Is it always going to be like this?" Layla asked quietly, her voice trembling. Jonathan turned to his daughter, his heart heavy. "I hope not," he said softly. "But when it is, we handle it the way we just did, with grace." Layla nodded, but the uncertainty in her eyes remained. For now, the immediate storm had passed, but the emotional toll was undeniable. The Miller family had weathered yet another moment of unwarranted hostility, and though they had come out of it with their dignity intact, the weight of the experience clung to them. But in that moment of solidarity, when a stranger had stood up for them, they found a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things could change. The airport lounge slowly returned to its normal rhythm after Linda's abrupt departure, but the impact of the confrontation lingered. Jonathan, Maya, and Layla sat together, their earlier conversation now quieted by the weight of what had just happened. The soft hum of chatter resumed, but the tension remained palpable for the Millers, each of them lost in their thoughts about the incident and its deeper implications. Jonathan exhaled quietly, running a hand over his face. He was proud of the way his family had handled the situation, maintaining composure despite the vitriol aimed at them. But he couldn't shake the exhaustion that came from constantly being on guard, always prepared for moments like these. He glanced over at Maya, who was holding Layla's hand in silent comfort. "We shouldn't have to go through this," Jonathan murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. Maya gave him a sad but knowing look. "We shouldn't," she agreed. "But here we are." Layla remained quiet, her thoughts still swirling with confusion and hurt. She couldn't stop thinking about Linda's words, how easily they had rolled off her tongue, filled with judgment and disdain. She had always known there were people like Linda out there, people who saw her and her family as outsiders in spaces like this, but experiencing it so openly, so brazenly, left her feeling unsettled in a way she hadn't expected. As the Millers sat in quiet reflection, the world outside their bubble was already beginning to react. Linda's outburst, though brief, hadn't gone unnoticed. Several passengers had recorded parts of the incident on their phones, discreetly capturing the moment when she had marched over to the Millers and launched into her tirade. By the time Linda had stormed out of the lounge, a couple of those videos had already made their way onto social media. Within minutes, the posts began to pick up traction, shared by those appalled by the blatant racism on display. People were tagging the airline, the airport, and even high-profile figures known for addressing social justice issues, calling attention to the ugly behavior that had unfolded. As Linda made her way through the airport, she remained oblivious to the storm brewing online. Her face was flushed with a mix of anger and embarrassment, and she gripped her purse tightly as she walked toward her gate. She had convinced herself that she had done nothing wrong, that she had simply been speaking her mind in a space where standards should be upheld. But there was a nagging feeling in the pit of her stomach, one she couldn't quite shake. Her thoughts raced as she replayed the scene in her mind. The older man who had stepped in, how dare he lecture her like that? And those people in the lounge, the ones who hadn't said a word but had clearly judged her with their eyes. What right did they have to make her feel like the villain? She had done nothing but express what she believed was true. And yet, the shame gnawed at her, no matter how hard she tried to push it down. Unbeknownst to her, as she reached her gate and took a seat, the first notifications began to ping on her phone. At first, she ignored them, assuming they were the usual flight updates or email alerts. But then the pings became more frequent, the vibration of her phone almost constant. Frowning, she unlocked her phone, and her heart sank as she saw what was waiting for her. Her name, her face, and the video of her confrontation with the Millers had gone viral. The video showed Linda in all her fury, her voice sharp and accusatory as she stood over the Millers, demanding to know why they were in the lounge. The comments underneath were a torrent of condemnation, people from all corners of the internet weighing in on her behavior. Unbelievable. "How can people still act like this in 2024? One comment read. "Shame on her. The family handled it with so much grace. She needs to learn a lesson," another user posted. "She should be banned from flying. The entitlement is disgusting," chimed in another. Linda's hands shook as she scrolled through the endless stream of comments. Her face burned with humiliation. How had this happened so quickly? How had she gone from simply defending what she believed was right to being the target of public outrage? Her phone rang, and she nearly dropped it in her lap. It was her supervisor calling from work. For a split second, she considered ignoring the call, but she knew that would only make things worse. With trembling fingers, she answered. "Linda, what's going on?" Her supervisor's voice was tense. "We're getting calls about a video that's all over the internet. It's you, isn't it? In the airport?" Linda's heart sank. It's not what it looks like," she stammered. "I was just trying to—" "I don't care what you were trying to do," her supervisor cut her off sharply. "This is bad, Linda. Really bad. We can't afford this kind of publicity. The company has a zero-tolerance policy for this sort of thing. You need to come in as soon as you're back. We'll need to discuss your future here." The call ended abruptly, leaving Linda staring at her phone in disbelief. Her future? What did that mean? Surely they weren't going to fire her over this. It was just a misunderstanding, wasn't it? But deep down, she knew. She knew this wasn't going to blow over. The company wouldn't want the backlash, and she had already seen how quickly things like this could spiral out of control. As the weight of the situation settled on her, Linda felt a crushing sense of dread. Her life had been built on control, on maintaining her place in the world, her career, her reputation. But now, all of that was slipping through her fingers, unraveling faster than she could grasp it. Meanwhile, back in the lounge, Jonathan received a notification on his own phone. He frowned, opening the app to see that someone had tagged him in one of the videos. He watched, his stomach twisting as he saw the scene from another angle, captured by someone sitting nearby. The comments were pouring in, many offering support and praise for how his family had handled the situation. Maya leaned over, watching the video with him. She sighed, shaking her head. "I wish it hadn't come to this," she murmured. "But maybe it's a good thing. Maybe it'll make people think twice before acting like that." Jonathan nodded slowly. "Maybe," he said. "But I don't want Layla to think that this is the only way change happens. Going viral shouldn't be the solution." Layla, overhearing them, looked up from her phone. "Dad, it's not just about going viral," she said quietly. "It's about showing people that this kind of thing still happens, that it's real. And maybe this will make a difference for someone." Jonathan looked at his daughter, his heart swelling with pride. Layla had always been thoughtful beyond her years, but he could see now that this experience had changed her. She was growing stronger, more determined. He could see the fire in her eyes, the same fire he had felt in himself when he was younger, fighting for justice in the courtroom. But at the same time, he wished she didn't have to learn these lessons the hard way. As the minutes passed, more and more people in the lounge approached the Millers, quietly offering words of support. One woman, a young mother with 2 children, smiled warmly at Maya. "I just wanted to say I'm so sorry for what happened," she said. "You handled it with such grace. Your daughter is lucky to have parents like you." Maya smiled, though there was a sadness behind her eyes. "Thank you," she said. "We're just trying to do our best." Layla looked up at the woman and smiled as well, though the weight of the day still hung heavy on her shoulders. As they prepared to board their flight, Jonathan glanced back at the lounge, the memory of the confrontation still fresh in his mind. The incident with Linda had been painful, but it had also shown him something important. The world was changing, slowly but surely. People were speaking up, standing in solidarity, and holding others accountable for their actions. Maybe there was hope after all. And as for Linda, she would face the consequences of her actions, the weight of karma catching up with her in ways she had never expected. The Miller family stepped onto the plane, their first-class seats a welcome respite from the turmoil of the airport lounge. The flight attendant greeted them with warm smiles, ushering them to their seats, and for the first time in what felt like hours, the tension seemed to ease just a bit. Jonathan settled into his seat next to Maya, while Layla, still quiet and contemplative, took her place by the window. As the plane taxied down the runway, Jonathan stared out at the expanse of tarmac, his thoughts still on everything that had transpired. He couldn't shake the feeling of exhaustion, not from the travel, but from the emotional toll of the confrontation. It wasn't the first time they had encountered someone like Linda, and it probably wouldn't be the last. But every time, it left a mark. Every time, it reminded him of the uphill battle they continued to face, not just as individuals, but as a family. Maya reached for his hand, sensing the weight of his thoughts. "You okay?" she asked softly, her eyes searching his. Jonathan nodded, though his expression was still distant. "I'm just tired," he admitted. "Tired of having to explain ourselves. Tired of defending our right to be in spaces we've earned just like everyone else." Maya squeezed his hand gently. "I know," she said, "but we've been through worse, and we've come out stronger." Jonathan looked at her, admiring the quiet strength she always carried. Maya had always been the pillar of their family, the one who held everything together even when things seemed to be falling apart. He admired her resilience, her ability to move forward without letting the bitterness take over. But sometimes he wondered how long they could keep enduring these moments without it wearing them down completely. Layla, sensing the gravity of her parents' conversation, removed her headphones and turned to face them. "Mom? Dad?" she said quietly, her voice breaking the stillness. "Can I ask you something?" Jonathan and Maya both looked at her, their expressions softening. "Of course, sweetheart," Maya said. "What's on your mind?" Layla hesitated for a moment, as if trying to find the right words. Do you think things will ever really change? I mean, people like Linda, they're everywhere. And it feels like no matter what we do, we're always going to run into someone who doesn't think we belong." Maya and Jonathan exchanged a glance, both of them feeling the weight of their daughter's question. It was a question they had asked themselves many times over the years, especially after moments like this. How much could they hope for real, lasting change in a world where prejudice still ran so deep? Maya took a deep breath, her eyes thoughtful. "I think things are changing," she said softly. "Slowly, but they are. People are starting to speak up. We saw it today, right? That man in the lounge, he stood up for us. Others came up afterward to offer support. That wouldn't have happened 20 years ago. So yes, I think things will change, but it's going to take time." Jonathan nodded, adding, "It's not about the world changing overnight, Layla. It's about how we respond to the challenges we face. Every time we stand up for ourselves, every time we show grace in the face of ignorance, we're setting an example. People notice, and it shifts the way they think, even if it's just a little. Change happens in small steps, not big leaps." Layla listened, but she still looked unsure. I just wish we didn't have to go through this at all." Maya's heart ached at her daughter's words. She reached out and gently placed her hand over Layla's. "I know, honey. I wish that too. But what matters is that we don't let moments like today define us. We don't let people like Linda make us feel small. We have to keep our heads high, no matter what." Layla looked down at her lap, processing her mother's words. She had always admired her parents' strength, the way they carried themselves with dignity even in the face of adversity. But it was hard to hold on to that dignity when the world seemed determined to tear it down at every turn. She felt the sting of Linda's words still lingering in her mind, gnawing at her sense of self. And yet, beneath the hurt, there was a growing sense of resolve. "You know," Layla said after a long pause, her voice quiet but firm, "I've been thinking a lot about what I want to do in the future. Like for my career. And after today, I think I want to help change things. I don't want to just sit back and let people like Linda keep getting away with this. I want to make a difference." Jonathan smiled, feeling a surge of pride. "That's my girl," he said warmly. "Whatever you choose to do, I know you'll make a difference. You've got a good heart, Layla, and the world needs more people like you." Maya nodded in agreement, her eyes filled with affection. "You're already stronger than most people your age, and whatever you choose to do will be there to support you." Layla smiled, feeling a flicker of hope ignite inside her. Maybe she couldn't change the world overnight, but she could start with herself. She could choose to stand up, to to fight for what was right, and to be a voice for those who couldn't speak for themselves. The plane lifted off the ground, its ascent smooth and steady as the world outside the window shrank into a patchwork of roads and fields. Layla stared out at the clouds, her mind still spinning with thoughts of the future. She thought about how Linda had made her feel small, insignificant, and undeserving of the life her family had built. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that people like Linda didn't get to define her worth. As the plane soared higher, Layla found herself thinking about karma, the idea that what you put into the world would eventually come back to you. Linda had put ugliness into the world, and now it was coming back to her in ways she hadn't expected. The viral video, the public outrage, the consequences that were beginning to ripple through her life. It was all a reminder that actions had consequences. And for the Millers? Their choice to respond with grace, to rise above the pettiness and hatred, was its own kind of karma. They had chosen dignity, and in return, they had received support, solidarity, and even a glimmer of hope for the future. As the plane leveled out at cruising altitude, Maya leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes for the first time since the incident. She could feel the tension in her body slowly easing, though the emotional weight of the day would take longer to shake. She knew there would be more moments like this in the future, more confrontations with people like Linda. But today, they had shown that they could endure. And more importantly, they had shown Layla how to endure. Jonathan rested his hand on Maya's arm, his own thoughts beginning to settle. He had spent years fighting for justice in the courtroom, challenging the biases and prejudices that ran deep in society. But today had reminded him that the battle wasn't just in the legal system. It was in everyday life, in places as seemingly mundane as an airport lounge. And while the fight could be exhausting, it was one they would continue to face together. As the flight attendants moved through the cabin, offering drinks and snacks, the Millers sat in a quiet but shared understanding. They were stronger because of what they had faced, stronger because of the love and support they had for one another, and stronger because they knew that the future, no matter how uncertain, was something they had the power to shape. The rest of the flight passed in relative peace. Layla drifted off to sleep, her headphones still in, while Jonathan and Maya shared a quiet moment of reflection. When they finally landed, they gathered their belongings and prepared to disembark, ready to leave the events of the airport behind them. As they stepped off the plane and into the fresh air of their new destination, Layla looked up at her parents, a sense of renewed purpose settling in her chest. The world wasn't perfect, and people like Linda would always exist. But for every person like her, there were others who would stand up for what was right. Others who believed in fairness, equality, and kindness. And maybe, just maybe, Layla could be one of those people who helped tip the scales toward a better future. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.